Lesson 5.6, factoring trinomials. Back in lesson 5.4, you were given a binomial times a binomial, and you were asked to multiply that. showed you three different methods. One was the distributive method, the other one was a rectangular box method or lattice method, and then the third was the FOIL method. And you just needed to figure out which of those you wanted to use to multiply the two binomials together to get your answer. And in what you did then is you took, for example, if I was to use the distributive method, I would take x times x and then x times 5, followed by 2 times x and 2 times 5. And I would get something that would look like this. I would get x squared plus 5x plus 2x plus 10. And we discussed that we had like terms in the middle. So we combine those like terms to get a final answer of x squared plus 7x plus 10. Lesson 5.6, factoring trinomials, is the opposite of what you did in lesson 5.4. In lesson 5.6, you're going to be starting here with a trinomial, and you're going to be writing an answer here, like this. We will use this idea, the pattern of the two numbers that add together to give us the middle term. And I know that 5 times 2, because I had to multiply it, also give me 10. So as I go through the examples, you're going to be looking and working with two patterns, two numbers that will add together to give us the middle term, and the same two numbers that multiply together that give us the third term of the trinomial. And we're going to work that to factor that into a binomial times a binomial. So we're going to be going backwards from what we did in lesson 5.4. So here's a couple of examples for you. We have x squared plus 8x plus 15. All right, looking at this, I say, okay, there are two numbers that were multiplied together, that were added together, two numbers that were added together that gave me a sum of 8, and they were also multiplied together to give me 15. So what I do to help me organize this is I build a t-table. And in this t-table over here, I will say I have factors of 15. And then over on the other side, I say that have a sum of 8. So factors of 15 that have a sum of 8. So I look at my factors of 15 and I start thinking about those. And I just write those down into my table. Well, let's see, 15, and notice this is a positive 15. So I have 1 and 15. I have 3 and 5. I could also use possibly negative 1 and negative 15, or negative 3 and negative 5. So I have 4 different pairs of factors that I could use to see if there's a sum of 8. My guess is already you figured out which pair it is. 1 plus 15, when I add that together, is 16. 3 plus 5, that's 8. So this is the pair that I'm going to work with. But let me show you the rest of this. Negative 1 plus negative 15 is negative 16. Negative 3 plus negative 5, that's negative 8. Now, something to keep in mind. My middle term has a plus on it. So that means the sum over here also has to have a plus. So I have positive factors that add to a positive answer. And when I want that, if I want positive factors that add to a positive answer, I'm going to need my numbers to be all positive. So I wouldn't even consider these as I work, because I know that positive means I have to have positive factors adding to a positive number. In this case, I want to use the factors of 3 and 5 because they give me that sum of 8 in the middle. So how do I do this? Below this, I'm going to write a parenthesis, a parenthesis, parenthesis, parenthesis. Looking back, if we look back here, how did I get x squared on line 2 here? It was x times x. So I have x squared is my first term. It's also my first term in my other problem here. So what I'm going to do is, what do I multiply together to get x squared? I multiply x times x. So I did the first. That would be the first thing that I would do. Well, then the next thing that I do is I have this x is going to be times a number, and then the number times the other x. That's what we did when we multiplied. So I have found that the factors 3 and 5 will add to 8. What I do is I do this. I write plus 3 and plus 5. So now I have factors 3x and 5x. So let's take a look at this. I have x squared. X times x, if I was to distribute, gives me x squared. X times 5, 5x. 3 times x is 3x. 5, so if you look at this now, here I have these two multiplied, and I have these two multiplied. 3x, 5x, 5x plus 3x gives me 8x, so there's my middle term. Now, the last thing I have is 3 times 5, and that is 15. So now I have factored this trinomial into a binomial times a binomial. I've gone backwards from what we were doing in lesson 5.4. Okay, take a look at that for a minute. If you have any questions, pause the video, bring me over. I'll be happy to help you with it. Let's look at another trinomial here. This one has a negative in the middle and a plus. Negative and a plus here. So now let's take a look. That means I have to have negative numbers that multiply to a positive number. Negative numbers that multiply to a positive, because my middle term is negative, so I have to have things that add up to negative 10, but they also multiply to positive 24. So what I need is this. I need the factors of 24 that have a sum of negative 10. Factors of 24 that have a sum of negative 10. So let's see here. Let's start thinking of our factors. Factors of 24, sum of negative 10. I suppose I could try to use like 1 and negative 24. I could have 1 be positive and 1 be negative. If I add those together, I do get a negative sum of 23. One problem with that though, if I multiply these two, I get a negative 24. So I can't have one number be positive and the other one be negative. Even though I got a sum that's negative that I need, I still have to have factors of positive 24 because at the end of the trinomial, it's plus 24. So when I put out my parentheses, I have to make sure that the numbers I put in the second place of the binomial, that when I multiply them, they have a sum that's negative, and when they're multiplied, they get a positive answer. That tells me I need both factors of 24 to be negative. So if I use negative 1, negative 24, that's a negative 25. Too high. Negative 2, negative 12. Negative 14, still too high, but much closer. Negative 3, negative 4, negative 7. Oops, not negative 4. My fault. Negative 8. Negative 3 and negative 8. So negative 3 and negative 8, that is actually a sum of negative 11. My apologies on that. Closer, but not there yet. I'm getting much closer. So that would leave me the last pair of negative 4, negative 6. Now, if you happen to think of this, think of that pair, before you get all the way through the list, it's okay to jump right to that pair. I just wrote this whole list out here so you can see how it works. I do want you to notice that if you can't think of it right away, notice I started with 1 in the number and then went to the next factor, in this case 2. The next size up would be 2. And then I went to 3, and then I went to 4, and so on. And if you notice here, 1 and 24, the factors are getting closer together as I go up the list. And once I reach that point where they're right next to one another, or I get a number times itself, I won't have any factors left to do. But here's my sum. Negative 10 and negative 4 times negative 6. So I'm going to write x and x, because I know x times x is x squared. I have to have these two factors, minus 4, minus 6. So if I multiply these out, if I do negative 4 times x, I get negative 4x. And I do x times negative 6, I get negative 6x. Negative 6 plus negative 4 is negative 10, my middle term. Now I multiply. The last thing I have to do is check -4 times -6. That's positive 24. So I have successfully factored this trinomial into a binomial times a binomial. Now at this point you might want to pause and stop the video. The video has been going on for 10 minutes now. And if you would like to, you can do these problems, numbers 1 through 8, 43 and 44 from page 304, because they are similar to the problems that I just did in this first 10 minutes of the video. So if you want to, you might want to pause it, do these problems here. Don't turn this in when you get done because there's a couple more examples after this. But if you'd like to, do these problems. They'll be just like the examples I just showed you here. Then come back to this video and you want to start somewhere around the 10-minute and 30-second mark. Okay, the next thing that we're going to look at with our factoring. One of the things that we talked about in 5.5 is always check your terms to see if there are common factors. So if I look here at this trinomial, I look at the numbers. I have 6, 24, -30. There is a common factor there in the numbers. That common factor is 6. I see a common factor of 6. I also see in the variables I have x cubed, x squared, and x. So I have in this trinomial, I have a common factor of 6x. I want to factor that out before I go into trying to factor the trinomial. It makes factoring the trinomial easier. So 6x cubed divided by 6x leaves x squared. 24x squared divided by 6x leaves a plus 4x. -30x divided by 6x leaves a -5. And the variable, there is only one x, x divided by x is 1. So now I have 6x as a factor outside of the trinomial x squared plus 4x minus 5. The only thing now that I need to factor will be x squared plus 4x minus 5. I have a factor of 6x removed on the outside. I'm just going to copy that down. I'm going to write 6x, and because now I have a plain x squared here, I'm just going to go parenthesis, like so. And I know since it's x squared, I know the first term inside both parentheses is going to be x, because x times x is x squared. So now I have to look here. I have a middle term that's positive and a second term that's negative. Now in order to, I have to add up to a positive number, and I have to have a multiplication that gives me a negative. In order to have a multiplication that gives me a negative, I will need factors of -5, and that have a sum of +4. In other words, what I'm looking for is one factor will be positive, one factor will be negative, and I have to have a positive answer. So let's take a look at how this works with our factors when you have factors of -5, sum of +4. I know that for -5, I have only a couple of choices here. I can do, if I wanted, I could do -1, comma, 5. Because -1 times 5 is -5. If I put a negative in front of the -5, I'm going to get a positive answer. That won't work. So I have one negative, one positive. If I add -1 plus 5, there is my sum of 4. So this is the pair I will be using. Now just to show you for demonstration reasons, I could also have +1 and -5. Works to give me the -5 and when I multiply. However, when I add, it's -4. So this is not the one I want. The one I want is this pair right here. I want this pair. So now I go back to my parentheses over here, and I know I need the numbers -1 and +5, and I write -1 and +5 in here. And I always want to mentally check this. X times x is x squared. X times 5, so I have x times 5, that's 5x. -1 times x is -1x. 5 minus 1, +4. So this is my final answer here. 6x times x minus 1 times x plus 5. Okay, a second example for you. This one also has a common factor in all the terms. It also has minus minus. So let's see how that affects things. Oops, this is supposed to have a 2 here. Copy error. Okay, so now I've got it copied correctly. All right, so let's look at the terms. I see a common factor of 5 because I got a 5, 30, and 35. I also see a common factor of x somewhere. I have x cubed, x squared, and x. That will be just a factor of x. The lowest exponent here is 1. So that means I have a common factor of 5x. So let's factor those out. 5x cubed divided by 5x is x squared. Negative 30, x squared divided by 5x minus 6x. And negative 35x divided by 5x will be minus 7. And x divided by x is 1, so I'll write only the 7. Here's a trinomial with just a plain x squared. So I know that the factors of negative 7 that add to negative 6. I need the factors of negative 7 that have a sum of negative 6. So let's take a look at that. Factors of negative 7, sum of negative 6. In the last problem, I had factors of a negative number that added to a positive. Notice here that that meant the factor that has a further distance from 0, or as you might term it, the larger one sometimes, this one is the positive number to give me the positive sum. Now down here I have factors of a negative number that give me a sum that's negative. So that essentially means that the factor that's further from 0 is the one that should be negative, so I have a sum that's negative. So if I look at it this way, 7 really only has two factors, 1 and 7. So in negative 7's case, I'm going to have positive 1 and negative 7. Positive times a negative gives me a negative. If I add these together, I do get a sum of negative 6. Just to show you for demonstration reasons, if I have negative 1 and positive 7, I get a sum of positive 6. So this is where I was talking that the factor that is further from 0, negative 7 is further from 0, so that will give me a negative answer. When I have the positive 7, it's further from 0 than negative 1, it gives me the positive answer. So this is why, in this case, when I look and see my sum is negative, that means, and my factors have to multiply to a negative number, the one from further from 0 has to be negative, and that will help me find the sum that's negative. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, call me over. I'll help explain it to you. So now back to our factoring. So I'm going to write 5x because I factored that out already. That's a common factor in all the terms. Parenthesis, 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 parenthesis. Now I got x squared. So that will be an x and an x inside each of the binomials. I need the factors of 1, so that's plus 1. And I need a negative 7 minus 7. Okay, so let's mentally check that. X times x is x squared. X times negative 7. X times negative 7 is negative 7x. And then I have 1 times x, so negative 7 plus 1, negative 6. And 1 times negative 7 gives me negative 7. So I have now factored that correctly. All right, that's it for examples here. This will be the last 8 minutes of the video. Here are the rest of the problems that I would like for you to finish from page 304 for this first time through on factoring trinomials. That'd be 9 through 11, and then numbers 95 through 97. Once you finish this part of the assignment, then turn in the work. So please turn this work in with the work that I assigned numbers 1 through 8, 43, and 44. Turn that all in together once you finish it. Be sure that you check your answers. Be sure that you get help anytime that you need it. Thanks. Talk to you later.